The old saying, an artist isn't appreciated in their time, stunk like a pile of steaming bullshit. Art was either respected or it was forgotten, and no passage of time would ever change that. I spent so much time editing smut that I didn't get to experience other kinds of BDs. And not just experience them, but relish and study them without having to worry about what I would need to cut out or tune up to learn new experiences or ways other artists impressed their own distinctive flair on their works. But the last week had been quiet enough that I'd finally managed to carve out some personal time. Things at Lizzie's were slow. Small piles of shards greeted me every evening, though I usually finished those with plenty of time to spare. My trips to the bar for food were brief, and I'd kept my distance from Xander, other than the brief visit I'd paid him a few nights earlier. But it hadn't been for me. It wasn't dust or anything like that. It was for us. There were only a few tabs of ice inside of the capsule. Not enough to fetch a high price. But Xander had given them to me free of charge. His way of making up for his perceived slight that had prompted my earlier outburst. I certainly wasn't about to argue with him. The way V and I had fucked that night, how wet we'd both been. What better way to get back in the swing of things? Once I was ready to, of course. I was spending another Sunday evening by myself. V had left in the morning for a gig, and I'd been in a foul mood ever since. I tried to snap myself out of it, even venturing out to the local BD shack to see if I could reignite my creative spark, which had been waning as of late. Most of what littered the shelves was trash, but I'd stumbled across one that had caught my interest. The braindance had been plainly named Orbital Vibes, and the cover artist had done a shitty job of things as it didn't stand out at all. It was only when I read the description on the back that my curiosity was piqued and I decided to pop a few eddies for it. I was glad that I had. At first, when I laid back and fired up the BD, I thought I'd been swindled. I was greeted by darkness, and there was nothing to hear or feel, but then a gentle weightlessness had begun to take a hold of me, almost as if I was suspended in water. A low rumbling in my ears soon followed as tiny pinpricks of light began peeking through the dark. When I looked down, I gasped in real time. The earth filled my entire field of vision. There was so much detail to take in. Oceans, continents, clouds. I'd seen plenty of pictures of what the planet looked like from space, but they didn't come close to experiencing it like this. The editor had been wise to eliminate the thought and emotion tracks as they would have gotten in the way. This was one of those rare BDs where the tactile, audio, and visual feeds all combined to create a profoundly moving experience, one which the viewer could interpret and feel the way they wanted to. The world seemed so peaceful as I floated above it. There wasn't a single corporate logo or gang symbol to be seen. No thick layers of smog or the blaring of angry car horns, and I couldn't hear any of the awful things people hurled at one another every single day. It was pure and untouched, and I yearned to be a part of it. A heavy thud suddenly reverberated throughout my body, disrupting the illusion. What was that? I pulled my wreath off as slowly as I could so I didn't jolt my senses. Another thud. I raised my head and turned towards the source. The light in the spare room was on, and a shadow moved across the floor. I glanced towards the front door. No sign of V's boots or jacket. I quickly shifted my gaze toward the knife block on the kitchen counter. Someone had broken in. My mind raced with the horrible possibilities. Was it a tweaker looking for a fix? A ganger trying to rip us off? Or perhaps Bishop had finally arrived, as I always feared he would, to mark me as his own once again. I rose from the couch as quietly as I could and tiptoed into the kitchen, considering the assortment of knives available to me. Something was tipped off. Whoever it was, they clearly weren't worried about making any noise. Could it be V? Was I overreacting? My hand was at the ready as I took a deep breath and braced myself. V? There was no reply. Instead, a pile of boxes crashed to the floor, sending a mess of paper spilling into the hall. Fuck! I breathed a sigh of relief. Why the fuck couldn't V just say hi when she walked in the door so she wouldn't scare the shit out of me like this? Shaking my head, I relaxed and went to see what she was up to. My relief was short-lived, however, when I turned the corner and jerked to a stop. No. The strong and confident woman I knew as V had been reduced to a disheveled mess, sitting cross-legged on the floor. Her clothes were torn all over and blood was smeared across her skin. She looked up at me with wide, panicked eyes. The same eyes I'd seen in the mirror when I'd stumbled through the door after my ordeal. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Judy, not to her. V! I rushed forward and knelt next to her. What happened? I was about to touch her when my hands came to a sudden stop just inches from her skin, almost as if I was afraid of being burned. If I touched her, would she scream and recoil? How would I have reacted if V had touched me when they'd left me under the overpass? But fortunately, I didn't need to worry about that. V reached out, gripping onto me as tightly as she could, nearly knocking me over. I wrapped my arms around her and felt her shaking from head to toe. What happened? Shit all went south, she sputtered between sobs. Fuckers were waiting for me. Shh, slow down, V. Tell me everything that happened. I forced myself to look her in the eyes and felt a horrible stab of guilt. I had known this day would come. She couldn't go out onto those streets day after day without eventually suffering the consequences. I'd even told her what would happen sooner or later if we didn't get out. And what had I done to protect her? Nothing. I'd sent her off with a kiss. V was trying to calm down, drawing deep, ragged breaths, even as more tears fell from her eyes. It was just supposed to be a simple clap, grab some shit from some crappy apartment in Kabuki. Fuck, I should have asked Dino about the goddamn client. What do you mean? V shook her head. The whole fucking thing was fronted by Wakako. Wait, you mean she set you up? V nodded. Retribution for leaving her hanging over that gig I ditched. Another stab of guilt to the heart. This one even worse than the one before. This was truly my fault. I didn't even see him coming. They grabbed me and they threw a bag or something over my face so I couldn't see. I was terrified to ask her, or rather, I was terrified to hear what she would say. But I needed to know, and I needed her to know that she could tell me and that I wouldn't think any less of her. This was my fault. V, did they? My voice caught in my throat. I couldn't say it. This couldn't have happened to her. I couldn't have failed yet again. I was supposed to be strong for her, to be there for her. And where had I been when she needed me the most? Sitting under the wreath, pondering how depressing my life was. No, V wiped her eyes and sniffled. They didn't get that far. I could feel an enormous wave of relief ready to wash over me, but I held it at bay and looked closely at V. Are you sure? You can tell me if they did. V shook her head with more confidence than I'd expected. They wanted to, but some random badges on patrol cut in and the whole thing turned into a bloodbath. It was a sick world we lived in where those words would fill me with relief, but they did. It hadn't happened to her. She was still V. I knew it was a shitty way to think about things. Even if it had happened, why wouldn't she still be her? After all, I was still Judy, wasn't I? I looked her over, studying the rips in her clothes. Most of the blood didn't seem to be her own, but there were some cuts and marks on her skin that needed to be cleaned up. My eyes wandered toward the floor. It looked like a hurricane had torn through the room. Boxes and their contents were scattered across the floor, and an old filing cabinet had been tipped over. What had she been doing? What were you doing in here? Her cheeks burned as the pain in her eyes morphed into shame. I need a fucking beauty. I'm sorry, Judy, but I fucking need one. I need one. the shrillness in her voice, the feral quality in her eyes. This was a matter of life or death for her. Thank God I had hidden those beauties, because if she had known where they were, could she have limited herself to just one in her current state? Probably not. She would have OD'd, and I wouldn't have known about it until it was too late. One thing was certain. I was in over my head and didn't have a clue what I was doing. But the answer was staring me in the face. Right foot, left foot. If it worked for me, it would work for V. I spoke slowly and deliberately, hoping not to provoke another meltdown. Let's just take things one step at a time and start by getting you cleaned up first, okay? That seemed to strike a chord in her. V allowed me to guide her into the bathroom and peel off her clothes. Every movement I made was delicate and precise. I didn't know the details of the attack, and I didn't want to catch myself on a piece of shrapnel or something worse. The cuts weren't deep, but there were more of them than I'd realized, and I couldn't risk leaving them untreated. I sat her on the edge of the tub and went to get the first aid kit. V was trembling when I came back, though she managed a nervous smile which helped put my nerves at ease. It's cold. I knelt next to her and rested a warm hand on her cheek. We're going to get you warmed up fast. I want to get these cuts of yours cleaned up first so nothing gets infected. V nodded and drew a shaky breath. I sympathized with every hiss that escaped her lips, the memory of the pain I'd felt when I set my aching feet in water still fresh. Some of it, I knew, was exaggerated. V never would have survived on the streets without a strong tolerance to pain. Still, I endeavored to keep her discomfort to a minimum as I sprayed antiseptic on each wound and bandaged the one that seemed to slice deeper. Stitches might be needed for a few, but this would do for the night. Once I was finished, I started a hot bath and picked her clothes up off the floor. It was a shame to throw them out, but they were beyond salvaging. Hey V, I called out as I threw on my shoes. Yeah? I'll be right back, okay? Okay. Are you gonna be alright for a minute? Yeah, go ahead. I stepped outside and made my way to the van, which was finally parked back in its normal place. The poor thing looked like it had been through hell and back. The entire driver's side door had been replaced with one painted in a slate gray finish that stood in stark contrast to the rest of the blue finish. Deep scratches still traced along the frame and a deep dent remained above the tire well. But I wasn't concerned with appearances as I threw the door open and rummaged under the seat. Fortunately, the mechanic's hand hadn't strayed, and I quickly seized upon the capsule containing the beauties. I was about to march back up the stairs when I paused. Once again, things were going too fast. I was supposed to be keeping V off of these, and I didn't want to mess that up. Granted, she'd been through an awful experience, but what would happen the next time? Where would I draw the line? With my back against the wall and a fiending addict waiting for me upstairs, I texted a message to the only number I could think of, and was surprised when I received a reply just a couple of minutes later. Dr. Carlisle stretched at the onset that she wasn't an expert in pharmaceuticals, but had quickly offered some eye-opening insights. Rather than going cold turkey, she was shocked to learn V had made it as long as she had without having a relapse or breakdown. It was better to wean her off of them. A full pill would be fine for tonight, but starting tomorrow, she would go on half doses every other day for 8 days to give her body time to adjust. I counted 11 pills. Doing the quick math, there was just enough left to make it through the suggested regimen with one to spare. This needed to work, because if it didn't, then the only option left would be to try and get her checked into a rehab program, and we didn't have the eddies for that. When I remembered that I had told V I would only be gone for a minute, I sprinted up the stairs. V had given up on waiting for me and was sitting in the bath I had run for her. The steaming water came right up to her jawline and nearly spilled over the lip of the tub. Everything all right? She asked. Yeah, sorry it took me so long. I think I got ourselves a plan. I held up the bottle and saw a mix of apprehension and hunger in V's eyes. I talked with a doc I know. They said you can have one of these tonight. One, V. Then you can take a half a pill every other day for 8 days to ease the withdrawal. I wasn't sure how to feel when relief spread across her face. This felt like a step backwards, but the instructions had been clear, and the medical logic seemed to make sense. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, V. I sat down on the edge of the tub. I'm the one who should be saying sorry. I was pushing you too hard, too fast. Didn't know what I was doing. I should have known better. It's not your fault. I'm the gonk who got hooked on him in the first place. I shouldn't have dumped all of this responsibility on you. You didn't dump anything on me. You're the one who's doing all the heavy lifting. The doc said it was incredible you stayed off of them for so long without needing something sooner. I returned V's smile before noticing how pink the water had turned. Most of the blood that had clung to her skin had come off, but there was still some on her face and hair. I grabbed a sponge from nearby and, after soaking it, began wiping her face clean. You're a Mason, Judy. Do you know that? I know, V. You're not so bad yourself. Thanks, V chuckled and closed her eyes. I was relieved to see she wasn't shaking any longer and seemed to be returning to her old self. So, you want to tell me a little more about what happened? V let out a sigh, but didn't offer any resistance as I turned my efforts toward her scalp. I don't think they were there to kill me. Otherwise, they could have just plugged me right when I walked in. I know what you're going to say, and yes, I need to be more careful. Well, at least I didn't have to tell her that once again, but the point just didn't seem to want to stick with her. How many more times could she be this reckless before her luck ran out? You think they were there to send a message? I think so. In fact, I got most of these cuts when the badges showed up. The whole place lit up with gunfire, and I took a face full of broken glass from a window. I nodded. It's a good thing they were around. Yeah, V agreed. Guess they must have heard my screaming. At least they heard you. Not everyone is so lucky. Jesus, V. I'm sorry you were so scared. She reached back and rested a comforting hand on my arm. I've been in some bad spots before, but nothing like that. There must have been 7 or 8 of them, and I couldn't understand a word they were saying but that fucking bag over my head. Translator couldn't pick it up either. I noticed the hairs on the back of her neck had stood up when she'd mentioned the bag. It must have been traumatizing, and I wish there was something I could do to erase that terrifying memory. But I knew better. You're lucky you got out of there in one piece. I know. I almost didn't. V was starting to tense up again, and I could see the thin veins in her neck pulsing faster than they had just a few moments earlier. You okay? V nodded and took a deep breath. One of them kept feeling me up. He was trying to get my pants off when I kicked him squarely right in the balls. She let out a short laugh. You should have heard him squeal like a little bitch after that. I realized as I continued mopping the bits of blood from V's hair that my pulse was racing alongside hers and my face had turned red. I clutched tightly onto the sponge. I'm glad you got out. Me too. I'm gonna talk to Dino tomorrow and fill him in on all of this. You're going back out there? Have to, V smiled. I'm not gonna let a bunch of pervs stop me from fighting the good fight. I'm a hell of a lot tougher than that. I tossed the sponge into the tub and ignored the look of surprise I earned when I pulled the drain plug. Seeing her bath was over, V stood up and accepted the towel I handed her. I'm gonna get us ready for bed, okay? V nodded and began drying herself off while I went to our bedroom and gathered together some clothes for her to wear, including a clean set of panties. I still didn't trust myself after what I'd done to her. Tonight had been a setback, but it wasn't V's fault. Even though it really had been. She'd gotten ganged up on because she didn't fucking listen to you, and the strain of all of it had caught up to her and caused a breakdown because she's a fucking addict who can't get her shit together. And I was doing well, all things considered. The bottle in the cupboard was still close to full, and I hadn't touched the one I kept at Lizzie's. Even Xander was growing disappointed with me after I'd refused his most recent advance a few nights earlier. I simply didn't see a need. My dispenser was still packed with dust he'd sold me months ago, and I had no intention of going back to it. In a strange way, I felt better about myself than I had even before the rape. Life had given me a vicious beating over the last month, and despite that, I'd grit my teeth and kicked my shit to the curb. I had every reason to be proud of how strong I was. If only V could do the same. But these nightmares... I needed to get a handle on them. You coming? V asked. Yeah, I'm coming. She was finishing up combing her hair when I set the clothes on the sink next to her. Thanks. I gotta admit, I'm looking forward to laying in bed and passing out for... Her eyes suddenly widened. Shit, I didn't mean... I know, I quickly interrupted. Like I said, this is the right way to do it. I'll get you some water. After filling a glass of water from the sink, I popped the cap off the prescription bottle and dropped a pill onto my hand. I couldn't believe something so light could cause so many problems. In fact, it was medical grade and could be freely taken by anyone with a prescription. I was confident that if I could afford an actual doctor, that they would probably prescribe them to me anyway. I looked over my shoulder. V was still in the bathroom getting dressed. Before I could second guess myself, I tossed the pill in my mouth and sent it tumbling down my throat with a sip of water. I quickly took out another and rested it next to the glass for V. It was only 1 dose, and we had a spare anyway. V had been taking these fucking things daily for over a year, and had managed to go without them for over a week before having problems. And I wasn't her. I was strong, and I knew what I was doing. V seemed nervous when she stepped out of the bathroom and saw the pill waiting for her. I was still a little uncertain about it as well, but it was what the doctor had told me to do. Please tell me I'm not enabling her. I gestured toward the counter. Down the hatch. V did as she was told before we turned off the lights and went to bed. She was drawn to me like a magnet, and I comforted her for as long as she stayed awake. But even after she had fallen asleep in my arms, I caught myself wondering why, if I was so strong, hadn't I been able to escape my fate the same way she had?